Hey everybody, I guess it's probably time to get started. So this is Study in Transparency, How Board Games Matter. So I'm Soren Johnson, and these are the basically four major games I've worked on. Probably most notably, I was the lead designer of Civ 4, and I wrote most of the game and AI code for that as well. And who I am now, I hope this isn't a little too on the nose, but I'm the founder of Mohawk Games. And we are developing an economic RTS right now, which we'll probably be talking more about sometime later this year. It's another way to describe that is an RTS without units. And if you're curious about that, just ask me about it after the session. All right. So let's talk about video games. You know, like these video games. But when you see these games, do you think of video games or do you think of something else? For example, Card Hunter. You know, when you see this, perhaps you think about D&D. Or when you see Hearthstone, perhaps you think about Magic. When you see Hero Academy, you might think about miniatures. When you see Battle of the Bulge, you might think about old school SPI Avalon Hill war games. And I'd like to take a moment to look at this incredible picture here. Because if you notice on that board, I count 2 calculators and 4 sets of tweezers. We've lost something, I think, in gaming. All right, so what are these? What are these games? They are often described as board games, but strictly speaking, these are video games. So consider Days of Wonder, which is a very successful board game publisher. They make Ticket to Ride, for example, which is a great game. However, Ticket to Ride, the app, outsells Ticket to Ride, the board game, by 3 to 1. It's perhaps not a fair comparison, but still, you could ask, is Days of Wonder a board game company or a video game company? Another way to put this is, are board games defined by their physical components? And if board games are supposed to be physical, then why do people still think of those video games I was talking about earlier as board games? What I'd like to argue here today is that board games are defined by their transparency. So let me talk about a few examples to clarify that point. So here's Memoir 44, and these are the dice you roll when you attack in that game. And the results are very direct. You see an infantry unit, that means you kill an infantry unit. You see a flag, that means you retreat. You see a picture of a tank, that means you can kill a tank. Here's Agricola. In this game, you have these various resource piles which build up from turn to turn. And so you have a very direct sense that you might want to grab that clay because now there's a giant stack of clay there. It draws attention, draws the player's attention. Here's Power Grid, a game which has a very transparent and simple model of supply and demand. This track here that runs along the bottom of the board, you see a bunch of sort of wooden markers. The black cubes represent coal, the brown is oil, the red is uranium, the yellow is garbage. And each of these different boxes you see represents a different price. So all the cubes that are in the far left box here are available for $1. But as players pick those cubes off the track, the price goes up, and that's represented directly by the fact that you look where the cube farthest to the left is. It's in the box labeled 2, so that means it costs $2. As you move further, it costs $3. And eventually you can get all the way to the end here, and it's going to be it'll be costing $8, and it might not even be available at all if someone decides to just buy up all of the coal that's available. Furthermore, each turn you are also adding resources back into the system, which represents supply. So every turn you're picking tiles up, or picking cubes up and moving it to the right, and then you're adding them back, moving them down to the left. So you see directly how the prices go up and how the prices go down, and it's very transparent to see how that's a direct result of player action. So thus, here we have a very simple, transparent mechanic that models the free market pressures of supply, demand, and scarcity. This is Shogun, a game that resolves its combat using this cube tower. and uses it to model the randomness of combat and also to mess with players' expectations. And I'm going to go into some depth here. So here's a look inside the tower. So you see that it's got these, I'm not even sure what to call them, but sort of these floors that you insert inside the tower that have these different holes in them. And that's there to sort of randomize the process of throwing these wooden cubes into the tower and seeing what comes out in the bottom. So here's a look at directly from the top, and you see it can take quite a winding path to get down to the bottom. So over the course of the game, let's say the blue player attacks the red player, moving 12 cubes against 7. So then what you do, is you take those cubes off the board. You set up the cube tower, you mix them all together, and then you toss them in the tower. Now, some of those cubes will come out, and some of them won't. And all you have to do is count up, however many the cubes of the two different players, and whoever has the most wins. Believe it or not, if you remember early on, blue actually had 12 cubes. So half of his cubes actually got stuck in the tower, whereas all of red's cubes came out, which is a pretty unusual result. But I actually did this, and this was my first attempt doing this to take these shots, and that's just how it worked out. And so poor blue player, you see, he could come back and look down, and there are all of his cubes stuck inside the tower of no use to him. However, the thing that's really interesting about Shogun is you don't then dump the cubes out of the tower so you have an empty tower. What you actually do is you leave them in the tower over the course of the rest of the game. So for the next combat, let's say yellow decides to attack blue, 4 cubes to 2. Well, you mix all those cubes together, you drop them in the tower, but remember, blue still has 6 cubes stuck inside the tower. And sure enough, blue gets some of those old cubes to fall out and ends up winning the battle. And now yellow has a cube stuck inside the tower. The physicality of which cubes come out or stay inside creates an unpredictable but transparent combat system. What makes this system so interesting is that the players can, and of course do, peek into the tower during the game to see which player still has cubes inside the tower, which affects their decision-making about who to attack. When blue lost a very tough battle by having 6 cubes stuck inside the tower, that hurt. But the upside was that the other players would be afraid to attack blue until all those blue cubes come out of the tower. Essentially, blue gets a short-term combat bonus, which will change how everyone plays. That's an interesting mechanic, but what is really interesting about Shogun is how the simplicity and transparency of the cube tower creates all this depth in gameplay. So I'd like to talk about these two games for a little bit, Race for the Galaxy and Innovation. And these two games are both based around a set of cards which have essentially rules printed on them, but they both do it in very different ways. So when you play a game of Innovation, the board looks something like this. And you see the sort of 5 different colors for the different types of technologies. And you see the sort of player in the bottom left. He has sort of all these cards splayed out on the table. But essentially, the sort of active technology is the one that's on the top. And that's the one that's sort of relevant to play at this specific time. And this is what these cards look like. The rules on the card are communicated as text. Thus, each card can have a completely unique power. And in a 4-player game, if you're talking about 5 active technologies, that means you could have 20 unique rules in play at any one time, which can also change from turn to turn. Now, the cognitive load of trying to understand the state of the board here is immense. A new player who wants to be competitive has to essentially force the game to a crawl to make sure each card has been read and understood. And often, sort of the social cost of doing that is simply too high. And a lot of new players just, well, okay, let's just keep the game rolling. I'm not going to actually take the time to understand, all the pieces on the board and what they mean, because, I'd have to literally read these, 2 to 3 sentence descriptions on each card, and that's just not going to work. That's going to slow the game down too much. But they're essentially just accepting the fact that they're going to be playing the game poorly, because if you don't understand, what the cards do, you're not necessarily going to be making the right decisions. Now, Race for the Galaxy is not so different. Each player can have up to 12 cards in play at once. although the cards are, each of the cards in Innovation is unique. In Race for the Galaxy, there are duplicates in the deck, so you don't quite have the same uniqueness problem. But here's the big difference. Let's look at the Race for the Galaxy cards. So you see, these cards do not have text. Instead, the designer has sort of invented this iconographic grammar to communicate the rules. So if you look closely at these cards, you'll see certain patterns repeated. Whenever you see a hand holding a card, that means you draw a card. If you see a little circle, which is the symbol for a planet, with a -1, that means it costs 1 less to colonize that planet. Red is the symbol for military, so if you see a +1 that's red, that means you get an extra military point. And here's the thing, this card here basically collects all of these iconographic rules in one place. And now, to be clear, this is actually a pretty big demand on the player to, okay, you want to play this game, you now need to learn this language before starting. However, I would argue that this is actually preferable to simply describing everything in text as an innovation, because the self-imposed constraint of a limited grammar keeps the designer from special casing, from over-designing the game. In Race for the Galaxy, there are going to be sort of these natural sets of cards, like, oh, here's some research cards, and here's some military cards, and here are some production cards. And in your mind, you can kind of group all those together and think of them in the same way. They'll have these interesting subtle variations, and there'll be hybrid cards, but you have these sort of schema or archetypes in your mind to use when you're considering what to do with these cards. In Innovation, every card is an island, essentially. There's nothing limiting the designer from doing something that's just radically different and unexpected with each card. And indeed, that's what you see with some of the cards in Innovation, because there wasn't that self-imposed constraint. The designer was able to kind of just over-design the cards and make the game very heavy and difficult to understand. They weren't committing to the advantage of having a consistent grammar. So if you think about video games, they can have their own grammars as well. In Thief, Garrett's main method of interacting with the world is via arrows, which is really its own type of gameplay grammar. The designers could, of course, come up with completely unique ways for the player to douse torches, cause distractions like fires and so on. You could have it so, Garrett could snuff out a torch with his hand, for example. However, by limiting Garrett's agency to just his arrows, the cognitive load is reduced on the player, because the player understands that he can start a fire simply because Garrett has a fire arrow. That is all the player needs to know. They just simply look in the backpack. I have a fire arrow. What do arrows do? They cause an effect on something in a distance. It's fire. I know what's going to happen when I launch it. As opposed, the player is not going to imagine a bunch of interactions that the game simply doesn't allow. He's just simply going to see these are the type of arrows available. Now I know what is possible to do in this world. So in contrast, Call of Duty is an example of a game that has a heavily scripted single-player campaign. And it doesn't really have a grammar. Anything can happen at any time, so the player never expects that the rules can even be understood. And is basically that the equivalent of the cards in Innovation? There is no system that runs in the player's head. There isn't really something to be understood. There's just something really to be consumed. So a game's rules are what keep the player engaged with the actual game part of the game, as opposed to simply consuming the scripted content. Thus, it's very important that the rules themselves be consistent and transparent. So now I'd like to talk about Yomi for a little bit. Yomi was designed by noted fighting game player and designer David Serlin. And Yomi is essentially his attempt to expose the core high-level mechanics of a fighting game to an audience that doesn't have either the dexterity or the free time to master such demanding games. And this is basically, in his own words here, competitive games tend to shut out most of the population because they tack on extra skill tests. Street Fighter, for example, requires so much dexterity with the joystick that most potential players are not able to experience the interesting mental challenges at the core of the game. I want to extract those great mind games and offer them to everyone, not just the few who can pass the other extraneous tests. So what he did then was he made this transparent abstraction of that inner game inside of fighting games. He boiled it down to this sort of rock, paper, scissors-like simplicity. And then, in a deck of Yomi cards, each card is explicitly categorized as belonging to one of those 4 types. And I'd like to draw special attention to the graphic design here. Usually, like as in a card game like Magic, the name of the card is put up in the upper left-hand corner of a card. That's sort of almost a standard. Here, however, it's in the upper right, almost as an afterthought. What is actually important is that it's an attack card, along with the various stats for that specific card. So a player sees this card and he thinks, it's an attack card of value 4. She doesn't think of it as spectral pull. Soren is making this categorization transparent. So, eventually, in fact, nowadays you can actually play a digital version of Yomi, which means you're playing a video game version of a card game that abstracts a different video game. That's how it goes. So the important lesson of Yomi is that games have a core inner game that is often invisible to casual players. And so it's important to make that inner game transparent as much as possible. Abstraction is a great tool for teaching, which is what's necessary to bridge the gap between novices and experts. So let's talk about Magic. Magic is a collectible card game, which is notable for having a rich metagame composed of drafting and deck building. And for those of you who don't know, deck building means that you have a deck of 45 cards you bring to a Magic game, and they can be pulled from the existing world of millions, I suppose, of Magic cards. It's up to you to build your own deck. Drafting means that before you build this deck of 45 cards, what you do is you pull up a hand of, say, 15 cards, and you pick one, and then you hand the cards that you did not pick to one of your, the player to your right or whatever, and then you keep doing that. So you're basically taking turns building your deck one after another. And you see, as you draft, you also see not just the cards you pick, but you notice which cards are missing, so you know what cards your opponent is picking as well. Now, it's important to note that these aspects of Magic are not part of the core rule set. In other words, it is not necessary to do either one to play Magic, but the game would not have become nearly as possible without this type of metagaming. So, let's say you want to build a great Magic deck. The problem is that there are a lot of cards to choose from. There's a lot of cards. Really, there are so many cards. And what are you going to do with all these extra cards? And not to mention, there's the problem of scarcity. See, there's a card up for sale for $6,200. I don't know if it's sold for that or something else, but that's what you can see with Magic cards. So the metagame is fun. That's really what drives a lot of the interest for Magic. But is it visible and accessible to most players? Will I really ever be able to actually experience Magic without committing to it as a lifestyle choice? So what we've learned recently is the metagame can be an actual game instead. Seven Wonders and Dominion split the metagame of Magic between them, making each part transparent and accessible to everyone. Dominion turned deck building into gameplay. By making the deck building the actual game instead of the thing you do before the game. Deck building is hugely intimidating for new players, and Dominion solves that problem by letting players do it one step at a time, all out in the open. Beginners can see what cards the veterans are buying and in what order, and even if they never catch up, they at least get to see how the winner won. Seven Wonders did the same thing for drafting by making drafting the actual game instead of the thing you do before the game. The process is that you draft a card and then you play it immediately face up. So just like in Dominion, the player gets to take it one step at a time and see what everyone else is drafting each turn. So it's a form of essentially learning while drafting. And drafting is now no longer scary. Instead, it's a transparent process. and players will much more quickly learn some of the subtleties of drafting, such as hate drafting, by picking a card that you know will hurt your opponent by not having, then rather than helping you, and then still comes out as a net win. That's something that you can pick up and feel as you're playing Seven Wonders, even though that's something that's not really a beginner strategy as you learn to draft in Magic. So the concept of making gameplay processes visible to all players raises an interesting question about something most strategy games take for granted, the fog of war. It's almost trivial to implement in a video game, and of course almost impossible to do well in a board game. So it's usually an automatic choice for video game designers to add fog of war to their games because, hey, it's this great thing that only we can do. However, there is sort of a hidden cost to fog of war in that new players don't get to see how the veterans are winning. Replays help, of course, but the typical RTS experience for many is sort of this quiet early game where you're building up and dropping down some barracks and mining some minerals and building some units, and then suddenly this happens. Now the RTS we're building right now actually has no fog of war. Players learn by watching each other, and of course, fog of war sort of runs counter to that. Now, there are important reasons why you have fog of war in RTS games. Like, there's no avoiding that, and it's not something that's going to go away. But perhaps mainstream RTS designers should consider simply shipping with an option to disable it, just for sort of learning matches, where you're helping people play. But there is this important core issue here where you don't want to hide what's going on. It's not necessarily a great thing to hide all of the interesting stuff that's happening in the game just for some sort of strategic mechanic, which is what you get out of fog of war. So ultimately, the important point here is that transparent mechanics increase a player's comfort with the game. Don't ask your players to make a bunch of crucial decisions like drafting a complete Magic deck before they've even experienced the game itself. This has always been a bit of an issue for how do you get new players into Magic, right? You can't. What are you going to tell someone who's never played the game how they should build their deck? It's basically impossible. You sort of basically have to build the deck for them and just drop them into the match, and then eventually they'll be able to understand that there's a metagame involved. But it's almost like telling you that this is this great game, but you aren't going to be able to get to it until you go through just go through these sort of rote steps of learning the basics first. So now I'd like to talk about two different kinds of luck found in games, which is very explicitly visible in board games. So pre-luck is talking about some sort of random event happens in the game, and then the player makes a decision or chooses an action based on that result. So this game here is Alien Frontiers, and it has a very clear version of pre-luck. It's a bit like crossing Yahtzee with Agricola, as you'll see here. So basically, the player rolls the dice, and then these dice themselves are the workers. And so then the player then gets to decide how to place them on the board depending upon the roll. So you have these different areas on the board, and they all have different rules for how you can place the dice in them. So, for example, the Colony of Constructor takes 3 of a kind. The Orbital Market takes 2 of a kind. And the important thing here is that luck creates a situation from which the player then reacts, which is not fundamentally different from, say, encountering a random map in a game of Civ. So post-luck, on the other hand, involves the player making a decision and then a random event determines the outcome. So Risk is sort of a classic example of this, right? Because the player decides which country to attack, moves in the units, and then rolls the dice to determine the outcome. Now, I don't want to go so far as to say that pre-luck is good and post-luck is bad, but games with pre-luck tend to be more engaging because the player gets to think and to adapt, to make the best of a bad roll or to take advantage of a great one. Post-luck games, on the other hand, can often make the players end up feeling like victims. So the combat system, looking at video games here, the combat system of RPGs often tend to favor post-luck. With players basically choosing the same few abilities and spells over and over again, and then the random number generator determines the result. The most interesting decisions get made when you're leveling up your character, when you're essentially choosing your build. That's when you make the decisions. And then the actual combat, which unfortunately is what you're doing most of the time, is somewhat rote. Card Hunter provides a really interesting alternative. Each player, basically your spells and abilities are represented essentially as a deck of cards. And each turn, you're kind of drawing 5 from that deck. And so even if you have some powers available that you really want to use, they may or may not be available depending upon what hand of cards you drew. Therefore, a player gets a different set of options to choose from each turn, which can make the gameplay much more varied and dynamic. So the big point here is pre-luck is a great way to give the player a clear set of interesting decisions, often by limiting which ones are available at each decision point. So I sort of moved through some great uses of transparency in board games, and here are kind of the main points I pulled upon, and I'm going to transition now to talking about video games. But I just like to review, that transparent, consistent rules run in the player's head, creating engagement. Transparent abstraction focuses players on the inner game. Transparent, visible mechanics increase player comfort. And pre-luck is a transparent way to present interesting decisions. These are all really valuable lessons I think can be applied to games of all type. So let's get back to talking about what this all means for video games. Real video games, not ones that could be mistaken for board games. But first I'd like to ask, what connects these games? Well, these 4 games, they're all story-driven. They have authored levels, fixed progression. And it's important to note here that I'm not talking about budget. All 8 of these games essentially fall within this category. And what that means is that these games are static. Static means that the game world is authored, set in stone. Each player is going to be confronted with the same experience. Even if they experience it in different ways, there is sort of this static world. And furthermore, they're meant to be finished to be consumed. But games can be dynamic. So what do I mean by dynamic? Dynamic games are unpredictable, rules-driven, challenging. They are meant to be replayed to be mastered. However, it's not necessarily black and white. It's a continuum. Some static games use dynamic systems. These games here have stories and authored progression, but the dynamic game systems mean that the player's experience will be more varied. On the other hand, some dynamic games use static content. These dynamic games are highly replayable, but make use of static content like maps or tracks and so on. Of course, there's lots of room for debate. Perhaps swapping these, is correct. At least in single player, StarCraft II is a very static game. There is a mostly linear set of levels which are meant to be solved in a specific way. Dragon Age, on the other hand, changes a great deal depending on the player's companions, story choices, and chosen skills. However, this is definitely, excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. So there's lots of room for debate. However, this is definitely wrong. There's no way you can argue that Last of Us is a dynamic game or that Civilization is a static game. So what's really important here is that you understand the extremes of the continuum. What it means to be a static game, what it means to be a dynamic game. And this is what I think is the most important point. For static games, the content is of primary importance. And for dynamic games, the mechanics are of primary importance. And so I'm mostly concerned here, in this talk in general, when I'm talking about the importance of transparency and what we can learn from board games, I'm mostly concerned about dynamic games. So not all of these lessons can be applied broadly to all games at once, but they're going to be most applicable to games on the right side of the spectrum. So what engages the player with the mechanics of a dynamic game? Well, I'd like to say that Transparency is the key factor. Spelunky, for example, is very upfront about what tools and challenges the players will have and how they interact, even if separate playthroughs is radically different. And there's lots of great examples here of good transparency and bad transparency in video games. So if you look at the Civ series as a whole, combat was a real mystery with Civ 1. You got a lot of unexpected results, a lot of phalanxes destroying battleships. You got wildly divergent outcomes. There was this whole collateral damage rule, which was that if I had a stack of 10 units and you attacked me and you killed the unit on the top, all the rest got destroyed, which was usually quite a shock to players who didn't know about that rule. And so as the series moved forward, we moved more and more towards transparency. And when we got to Civ 4, there was sort of a key you could hit when you moused over a potential battle that would show you directly these are your odds of winning this battle. They're 80%, and these are the different modifiers for that battle. And after the battle was fought, there was a battle log you could look at, which would actually explain all the roles. And then Civ 5 did a wonderful job with sort of this very simple, transparent piece of UI that you would see before combat that showed you, the approximate damage that's going to be inflicted, your strength, their strength, what are the different modifiers. We would always get, we always felt like player engagement went up the more open and transparent we made the rules and the aspects of combat. The more the players were able to understand ahead of time what is the result of what is the potential result of the action that they are choosing. So here's another couple examples of games that both had a global scale. The one on the left here is Sim Earth. It had a lot of complex interrelated systems that were hard to describe and hard to understand, a lot of chaos theory and snowballing. If you look closely at the screen there's a very helpful diagram that talks about carbon dioxide absorption and thermal tolerance and very simple, easy stuff to grasp. DEFCON, on the other hand, simplifies the globe to just the bare, it's a beautifully designed game, just the bare minimum amount of information required to play the game. And just these subtle points, like, for example, the missile trails. When you look at a missile moving, you don't just see where it's headed, but you also see where it came from. There's a lot of information present in the few bits of data visible to you. Interface is a great place to employ transparency, to shed a window on the system in the background. These UI elements here both highlight, sort of chunky, as you say, Boolean-based aspects of the game design. A critical hit in Team Fort 2 is a distinct event, and so they really highlight that directly every time that happens. Opening and accepting a quest in WoW leads to a very distinct state, and so that exclamation point was sort of real important innovation in the interface. You can have transparency via systems. It's always this is one of the reasons physics is very popular as a gameplay system, because it's sort of inherently transparent. All you have to do is be human and know what it means to fall down and try to get up and to throw a ball. You already have a sense of how the gameplay is going to work. And this is an important one here. You can make your gameplay transparent via theme if you're smart about how you are positioning your game. When you told someone, so in a tower defense game, at its core, it's based around the concept of you place down static towers, which then fight slow-moving, AI-controlled characters. Creeps is what they're called, but basically AI units that are moving in to attack you. And sometimes those games are very abstract. Sometimes they're not, but you still have to sort of teach a player that this is the core of the game. You're placing down these units that are not going to move, and you're defending against these slow-moving objects. Well, all you have to do is say the words "plants versus zombies," and someone understands that intuitively, right? You know that plants can't move, And you know that zombies do, but well, most of the time, they move slowly. So that pairing was a brilliant way to make the gameplay that existed within the game transparent to the player. Triple Town is a match 3 that is sort of a match 3. I'm not sure quite how to describe it, but it's built around these combinations. The match 3 is built directly into the game's art by 3 bushes becoming a shrub, and then 3 shrubs becoming a tree, and so on. Each of these levels is sort of easy to imagine, and you sort of anticipate what the next one is, and you even wonder what the one is 3 or 4 levels above you. And you can also go a long way, getting transparency via help. This is the city screen in Civ 4. And if you mouse over essentially the food in the production bars, which is also sort of where you see your health and your happiness. In this case, I guess the player has moused over the happiness. You get this explicit breakdown of all the different factors that explain why the city has 23 happiness and 15 unhappiness. I'm not sure if you can read it, but some of those reasons are, +6 unhappiness because it's too crowded. That means there's too many people in the city. +4 because of war. This war has been going on for too long. +1, we will not fight with our brothers and sisters in the faith. That means you're fighting another civ, which happens to be of the same religion as you. On the other side of the ledger, you see things like +12 happy. We enjoy our luxurious resources. All the furs and the diamonds and the spices that you've been bringing in the city are making your players happier. So this is a nice way to really, there's a lot of stuff going on inside a game of Civ, and it's great to have that all broken down into one specific place. And this was even more true when you're talking about diplomacy in the game. This is the diplomacy game, and this is the diplomacy screen in Civ 4. And diplomacy has always been a very challenging thing in the Civ games because there's complicated algorithms going on in the background controlling what the AI is going to do. And sometimes those algorithms do things that even surprise the people who write the code themselves, right? And what we discovered over time is that the more we're able to expose about the reasoning that's going on inside the AI, the more engaged the players come. And this was sort of a hard-earned lesson because oftentimes our intuition as designers was that we wanted there to be a little bit of mystery there. That the AI is supposed to be a replacement for a human. Right? And humans are unpredictable. Humans have their own quirks and their own vendettas, and maybe they want to get to revenge. And there's a lot of depth to playing a game with a human. And theoretically, the AI is supposed to replace that. But the simple truth is, players know when they're playing an AI. You're not going to be tricking them, and they have inherently a certain expectation that the AI should behave a certain way. And if the AI deviates from that, it's important that you're able to explain to them why that happened. So in this screen here, what I actually originally did, there's sort of like 5 states of diplomacy or of attitudes in Civ 4, from going from furious to angry to cautious to pleased to friendly. Those are the 5 different ways the AIs can consider you. And originally that was all we were going to show. But as I was writing the AI to the game, I often was surprised why a specific AI that I thought should hate me was pleased, or vice versa. So I basically added some debug code so that I could mouse over that and I could see the numbers behind that. And that was just part of the game for a while, and our testers saw that, and they loved it. That was something they responded very positively to. And anytime we tried to take that away, it was something that caused a lot of frustration. And also, beyond that, as soon as this stuff was in there, we saw just a very different tone when people started talking about the diplomacy in the game. People were less frustrated. They were more directly engaged with what was going on. They were thinking more deeply about what was actually going on in the game, as opposed to kind of a lot of paranoia and conspiracy theories and a lot of, kind of strangeness about the AI. So you see here directly on the screen, there's a plus run modifier because years of peace have strengthened our relations. There's a +2 because we appreciate the years you have supplied us with resources. There's a -1 because you declared war on our friend. So beyond explaining to the player why the AI feels this way, it also helps teach the player the importance of their decisions further on in the game. So farther down the road, they know the effects of declaring war on the friend of someone else, and that if I declare war now, I will kind of lose that bonus of the fact that we've been at peace for centuries. It's a very, very important teaching tool. So ultimately, if the mechanics are primary to a game, then I really want to stress that a key factor is transparency. All right, thank you. All right, I think we have some time for questions here.
Thanks, good talk. Soren and I have been arguing about this for years. So. But I was interested in, I tried to find many things to disagree with, but I only found one thing really to disagree with. So
fair enough.
It was when you said that there's a core part of the game it was basically around the Serlin stuff.
Sure.
And that there's a core part of the game that basically eschews the micro and it's only the macro to use RTS or strategy and tactics or whatever. But at least my experience in making Spy Party is that like the micro in games like that is actually part of the core and like is in kind of an inextricable way, which is one of my criticisms about the idea of taking too much from board games. So I was wondering if you could talk more about that, because I don't agree with the fundamental concept that every game has this core thing that is not micro,
sure,
that you can pull out of it.
So you don't believe that Spy Party has the inner part that could exist without the micro?
I think, for example, the pathing and the micro is part of the game of performing like the spy, for example, or the aiming aspect. It deepens the game for the sniper. And I think that's true in a fighting game and in a whole bunch of other games. Like that kind of performance under pressure, there's a whole bunch of things that aren't, like a real-time and a strategy game aren't the same. And so one of my criticisms about taking too much from board games is there's the whole Stalinist, like quantity has a quality that's all its own. The fact that you're running at 60 hertz and you're evaluating millions of things a second changes the thing completely.
Well, so, I think the micro can be the game, for sure. And I think those are aspects of Spy Party you identified that are important. They're not ones that should necessarily be abstracted away. I think the issue for Serlin was that having achieved a level of mastery in fighting games, he became aware of this whole other type of game that most players just never saw, right? And he wanted to expose that. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you wouldn't want to have any type of micro in fighting games. I think perhaps the issue, and I'm probably putting words in his mouth now, is that there was perhaps the micro parts of fighting game perhaps got fetishized a little bit. That's where it kept the genre kept growing. They kept adding more buttons and more combos and longer combos, as opposed to instead trying to pare that stuff down and trying to bring out this beautiful thing at the heart of the game. I think Dive Kick is an example of a game that also is sort of pushing towards that inner core of fighting games. I think there's room for both. I mean, I think that the games that really focus on the micro fighting, I think that's fine too. But maybe they should really think through what it means that is what the game is. That they're really making a fundamentally Twitch-based game, and perhaps those games should have less mind games. I don't know. That's just I'm not the fighting game expert, but. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to get your take on iPad ports of some tabletop games with respect to sort of information and UX design. I think of games like Stone Age and Puerto Rico, which I think have been ported really successfully, and they create, a fun experience. And then I think about a more complex game like Eclipse, in which, from my perspective, there's just too much going on, and it's too hard to actually play something like that on an iPad. Do you think that there's sort of a complexity point in terms of board games beyond which it just doesn't work in a digital format?
Yeah, I mean, we're, I think, in this early stage of the sort of transition. Like, at this point, board games were designed just to be board games, and then the iPad came along, and now, I want to play all these games I've never gotten a chance to play in real life on my iPad. And sometimes that works out wonderfully, and sometimes the UI is a bit of a disaster, either based off of execution or that the game is just simply too complicated, right? I think the next wave is people designing games aware that perhaps most people are going to be playing this game on an iPad instead of in person, or that the two need to fit together, or stuff like Battle of the Bulge, where it's made by war game designers, but they're fully committed to the iPad. I mean, that game is built to fit exactly within the iPad screen, and just makes a beautiful use of a touch interface. So I think that's what there is to be excited about in the future for mobile board games.
Thank you.
All right. Oh, wow. All right, go.
Hi, I have a question about Fog of War. I love your magic slides, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
We live in a world of YouTube and like Twitch where maybe it's not too difficult to see how a good player is beating you, given that there's these avenues to see high-level play of these games that do use Fog of War. Does that make it less of a decision to actually use it?
Sorry, I'm going to need you to repeat the question once.
So using Fog of War, you said a problem is it hides what your opponent is doing and possibly how they're beating you.
Right.
So you may not learn how to play the game.
Right.
But because of YouTube and Twitch, stuff like that, people can see high-level gameplay.
And beyond that, I mean, like StarCraft 2 did a wonderful job of bringing replays into the experience, and at the end of the game, it'll show you that direct list of all the different actions. They built 4 SEVs, and then they built a Vespian. They built on the Vespian gas, and you see the exact order that they took. So if you're wondering how you fell behind, you can kind of like look at that build order and kind of imagine it. I mean, like I'd say in a sense they're aware of the problem. I'm not sure whether consciously or not, but they know that they want to expose what happened in the game as much as possible, even with a Fog of War. So, I mean, Fog of War is here to stay. I mean, it's one of the great things that video games does, and it's not going to go away. But you definitely shouldn't just assume that it should be there in a strategy game. That's the best way I would put it. All right.
With transparency in mind, how do you approach games whose core gameplay is founded on things like hidden information or lies or betrayal, and things like hidden identity games and the like?
Yeah, well, I'd like to draw a line between sort of rules transparency and hidden information, which is perhaps something I should have got into. I mean, there's a lot of great board games where everyone understands the rules, but of course they don't know what cards someone is holding, and the sort of the classic block war games, the blocks are sort of turned around, and you can't tell if that's a tank or an infantry or an artillery or whatnot. And so that's just a great tool for game design, hidden information. There is sort of this higher level issue of some simulations, sort of the Paradox games, EU, Crusader Kings, or simulations in general, things like Out of the Park Baseball. These games are kind of built around this concept, or part of the appeal of these games is you're never quite sure what's going on under the hood. And there's no getting around that is not transparent. And transparency is not just this goal you should always aim for. It's just this important tool if you want the player to engage with a certain set of rules. So the point is that if you're making a game like Out of the Park or whatever, you should know that you're purposely making an opaque set of rules, and you should design that into the system that, like, okay, so they don't know what's going to determine what happens in each specific game of baseball, but we should provide hints. We should have some scouts that give some bits of text to explain why players kind of behave certain ways. You just need to be very aware of what you're doing because you're choosing not to be transparent. All right.
Cool. This question is kind of related, I think. So I love this talk, and I thought it was great, and it did a great job representing a point of view that I think is completely valid. Cool. But there's this opposite point of view, which questions a lot of the assumptions you were making about whether players are supposed to be comforted and supposed to be satisfied and have clarity about what they're achieving, right? And so in games, obviously, the system is the message, and a game like Sim Earth is actually an amazing game in part because it captures that idea so perfectly, And so the idea of a diplomat being represented as almost a robot kind of sends this message that's very different than what it's like to real diplomacy and real interactions with humans. So I guess the question is, have you thought, to what extent do you think, you're obviously a super smart person, and you're coming down on one side of this argument, to what extent have you thought about those dogmas and playing
Sure.
with the other side of that argument?
Well, I like to think of it as it's a certain type of, transparency is a certain type of gameplay aesthetic, right?
Yep.
It's a specific way to make a game, and I think what's important is a lot of people are making games that should be transparent, but they're not making the effort to make them transparent, as opposed to other people who are making games where they're maybe purposely choosing that they want the game to be somewhat opaque because they don't want the player to have control over the system. In Civ, we learned over time that our player base wants to have sort of full control and full understanding over the game. Or perhaps even that's just the gameplay aesthetic that we chose, right? I think there's a very direct contrast between the Civ series and the EU series in how they approach that. These are almost like, if you chose those two different paths, these are the type of games that you would make. And that's fine. It's mostly I'm just trying to highlight that, like I said, that you are making a choice. And there's many great games I love that are opaque, for sure.
Cool, great answer. Thanks.
As you're looking at making complicated systems transparent to the player, which was really useful in Civ 4, the one thing you end up with, at least in that game, is a laundry list of just like a whole bunch of individual points that the player all has to pass. Have you thought about, and this might be very domain specific to every game you're working on, how you actually visualize that and how you maybe take more than one or two systems, like saying in Civ there's 3 guys and how they're related and what their interconnection is, and how you actually visualize it to the player? Or, at what point does the underlying system become so complex that you don't want to show it to the player anymore,
Right.
but you need to figure out a way of how you show that?
Yeah, so that's a really tricky issue. So to be clear, what you're talking about is that at some point, you write game code, and perhaps that game code can be expressed graphically. Perhaps it can be expressed in text. But it needs to be expressed in a limited amount of screen space, right? But perhaps at some point you write code that stretches beyond that, and there's just no way to express that concisely. Is that sort of what you're getting at?
Yeah, and you probably want to make sure that the player at a glance can see the interconnections instead of having to go through a list of a whole bunch of stuff that you as the programmer don't mind going through individually.
Yeah. I have a number of different theories about this. Like, for example, if I was to make a baseball sim, I would probably have it so that you look at a box score. You play out of the park, you look at a box score, you're not really sure what happened. You know all the players involved, you know what the ratings are, but you don't know why the game decided that at this moment this guy struck out and why this guy hit a home run or whatever. What I would probably do is just allow you to essentially click on that at-bat, and it jumps to something else that shows you the exact breakdown of, like, these are the dice that were rolled, and these are different modifiers, and this is why it ended up here. And I wouldn't expect that players would do that all the time, but it's just sort of comforting to know that that's possible. And theoretically, most game systems, I think, could be broken down enough that it's a bit like a fractal. You can arrange it so you can sort of keep drilling down farther and farther to get at the correct amount of information. But I do think that perhaps that might not work out so well in practice. If with a really very complex system, like, I'm not sure you could do that with a game like Europa Universalis, just because I think it would just be overwhelming. I think perhaps a good way to do it is to, this is another thing that's kind of more in terms of just theory, is that if you release the game code, it kind of allows the community to essentially discover the game and develop their own accurate understanding of how it works. Because there's also sort of this open question about when does a player need to know what's going on, right? If you have a pretty complex game, you can perhaps design the game in a way that, so for a new player, you give them enough information that they're able to proceed, but at some point, if they want to keep delving into the game, they're going to want to know what's actually going on. And that's when you have to worry about that. But at some level, like, this is sort of a tension that I think can't quite be resolved, because for sure in Civ, there were times when we wanted to try a certain type of game mechanic, and we realized there's probably really no way to describe this on the UI, right? It's going to probably end up as some sort of black box. And so, 90% of the game is explainable and comprehensible, and then there's this 10% here that, well, sorry, it's really complicated. And I think we made just a high-level choice not to do that, right? That we thought that didn't fit with our perception of Civ. But if you really want some of those mechanics, then, yeah, I mean, it's a challenge. I'm not sure there is a total answer for that. All right, cool.
So your talk seemed to be about two things: the importance of transparency in rules, making sure the rules are accessible to everybody, but also the grokkability or the understanding of the math in the game, which can be complicated. So in board games and Magic cards, you rarely see numbers and digits. Numbers go into the double digits and further.
Right.
But games like, let's say, Diablo, start off at level 1, very understandable. The numbers are small. But as you advance, they get to these 6, 7, 8-digit numbers that the human brain can't parse or compare easily.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any tips, tricks, best practices, anything like that, that when the numbers in RTS games or anything with sort of stat exponential growth, to rein it back into understanding for players.
That's a good challenge. I mean, those games are always tough because they're sort of built around inflation, right? I'm glad I haven't had to design a game like that. That's a big challenge. I mean, I know in Civ, we're always did our best to start the first units with a strength of 1 because we knew that we wouldn't have to go up higher than maybe 25 or 30 by the time we got to the end. I think that maybe, just off the top of my head, perhaps what I would do is if you're talking about damage per second or something like that, almost have 2 different systems, one, have a color-based system, right? That this is almost like logarithmic, I guess. I'm not sure what the right math term would be, but it starts at blue, and then the next level is green, the next level is yellow, and the next level is orange and red, and each of those levels essentially maybe represents a factor of 10 or 100 or something, and then you see a specific number on top of that. So the player maybe intuitively understands, okay, I want to go up that color chart as much as I possibly can, and then within that color chart, I can kind of compare between them. Obviously, I want the higher number, but red is always better than orange or something like that. I mean, I might try something like that, but yeah, I do think that any time a game has a meaningful value that's higher than 1,000, something's gone wrong, basically. I've seen a lot of Japanese RPGs where it's they're losing, they have 90,000 hit points, and it's just that's kind of baffling to me. All right, go ahead.
Is there a danger, or do you see a risk in too much transparency, in the sense that once everything's laid out on the table and once all the knowledge is there, it's possible for situations and mechanics and games to become sort of solvable, or just turn them into an optimization spreadsheet, which sort of isn't as much fun? So
right. Well, it depends on what your intention is as a designer, certainly. There are plenty of games that it's not solvable in a sense. Go has very few rules, but clearly it's not solvable, right? And of course that's because there's another player involved. But what's the right way to put this? I think that Civ has a bunch of rules. They're fairly transparent. You understand what they are, but ultimately there's too many different factors going on at the same time for someone to come up with some sort of ideal answer. And that's kind of where you want to be if you're making a single-player game. And so I think that for sure that's a big issue if you're especially making a single-player game. So that's what I would be worrying about. If you're making a multiplayer game, I think that is not necessarily. You just need to see the feel. How does the game feel? There's nothing inherently better or worse about having more or less rules. Well, actually, generally it's better to have less rules. But okay,
thanks.
All right, I think that should do it. Thank you.